what took you to channel your emotions right now on a platform that's otherwise associated with other things?
It's a difficult question, and thank you for asking it. And the idea is that, I had waited maybe more than a week to do a video, and to a lot of folks, it felt like, why aren't you saying anything? But there was a bit of a dilemma there in that, on the one hand, uh, I don't think that some of the folks who are on Instagram, myself included, necessarily should be looked at for to be a voice if they don't have the expertise, or maybe it's like if they don't deliver it in a certain way. That's one. And the second one, I was noticing that from a lot of the people I know, that they were surprised and disappointed and shocked that their friends who they thought were, let's say, would have been pro-Palestinian, turned out to not be. And there was a bit of a common factor to all of this, in that, especially their friends talking in the US or in Anglophone countries, they were using language where, if someone is not already, if they don't know where they are, or if it's kind of like they're not uncertain, they would reject that message right away because of the certain language that was used. So I wanted to put it in a way where it's kind of like, I want to remove any language that would be considered triggering. And, but without, again, it's kind of like, just have the principles, but without using language that I would not want to use, or I would not want to hear if someone was on the opposite side. And to be more specific, there's been a tendency in the past few years in that anything that's related to what's called social justice that comes from the US or Anglophone countries, the language is academic in the negative sense of the word, in that it feels a little bit, how to say, exclusive as opposed to inclusive. As in, if you want to start your conversation by calling people, it's kind of like, I don't know, the racism, the colonizer, these kind of words, these words, if someone is on the other side, automatically they're not listening to you. And if someone doesn't want to listen to you, then what is the point of us talking altogether? In the end, we will end up just sharing messages among people who agree with each other. And what's it? Sometimes we do it because we're angry, and it's kind of like, look what's going on, which is fine. But if you want to have a conversation with someone that doesn't necessarily agree with you, you have to use a different language. And that different language didn't come from, right now I'm speaking in English right now, right? But the rhetoric that I use is not necessarily that of the English language. And if I just want to elaborate a little bit more, is that every language has its own rhetoric. As in rhetoric, I'm talking about the original meaning of the word, as in like the art of discourse and how you might convince someone, right? So for Semitic languages, specifically for Arabic, we talk about ilm al-balagha, which is like how you talk with someone. One of them, like one part of it, is ilm al-ma'ani, which is what words you want to use, what are the semantics that you want to use, and you want to target them for the audience that you hope will listen to you. So for that, I in my mind, I was like, okay, let me simplify the language for someone who doesn't necessarily agree with me, while at the same time having, okay, these are my principles, and listen to them from the point of, these are my principles, but I understand where you're coming from. Kind of like that. I don't know if I oversimplified it or overcomplicated it. I'm not sure.
Actually, it's almost like I want to hear you just keep talking, because you're taking me places naturally.
Okay.
And I think you
I'm
did two
fine.
things that I enjoy, which is you avoided audience capture, which is difficult, meaning you were willing to maybe trigger, if I could use that word, a segment that may not agree with what you're
Yes.
saying. So that is a very important thing to do. You're also abiding by principles naturally,
Yes.
but you're also expressing what you see, which I think is fundamental. Even if you don't agree, you're giving benefit of the doubt to the other narrative, and
Absolutely.
then step by step debunking, which are more myths than facts. Now, you did this in 5 minutes, and you did something which I think is difficult. You tried to talk about fundamentals, liberty, freedom, independence, agency, words that I think are kind of put aside when there's hysteria, emotion, and anger. It's almost like you were giving moderation a chance on social media, and I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's trying to rectify, but like you said already, don't negotiate your
Yes.
principles. I think you found a way to do it, which is not easy.
Thank you. I honestly didn't think of it kind of like, how to say, it turned out to be because I got asked this question was like, oh, you did it and it wasn't. But in my mind, it wasn't like that. In my mind, it was very, just reduce any of the unnecessary and build up on that. And me mentioning, the U.S. Declaration of Independence, it wasn't pandering to the Americans. It was
Yeah,
because it
yeah,
was really, it's kind of like, these are beautiful principles, theoretically, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. How about we just start from there? So that
yeah.
that was what was going on in my mind.
Now, anyone who hasn't seen the video, I think it was released. I saw it on Friday. I don't remember if it came out Thursday or Friday, but it's just a few days ago. You just have to scroll back a bit. It's there. I'd like to take what's happening now and go back in time a bit, but it also relates geographically. You're living in Ireland, in
I am.
Dublin. Okay. I'm stuck here in Beirut, sweating my ass off. I'm guessing in Dublin, you're not sweating right now. It's probably lovely outside. It's probably the right time of the year.
It's really raining heavily, but I don't mind.
Okay, yeah, me neither, Sarah, me neither. I've been to Dublin. I actually spent, this is roughly 20 years ago. I spent several months in Northern Ireland, in Belfast. And I guess aside from this part of the world, it's probably it was so striking that the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is displayed so much in the remote geography of Northern Ireland, but not in a artistic only way. It's politics. There's a lot of residents, and also it's both sides. You'll see a beautiful mural. You will see something that's maybe somewhere between Sinn Féin and the IRA, dancing between, and then a giant Palestinian flag. Around the bend, Israeli flags. On the street, Israeli graffiti, Israeli messaging. So I thought that was stark, and that was it caught me off guard. I didn't know it's that severe. I'd like to know your experiences there because you live in Dublin,
Yes.
and I'm sure you're at work, friends, you're probably talking about this issue all the time. So your own relationship being in Dublin to what's happening right now.
Yes. Thank you for that. So in here, as you mentioned, it's important to divide the issue, let's say, between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So in Northern Ireland, as you said, you might see the opposite. You might see Israeli flags and stuff like that. In Ireland, you won't see that in Dublin. But why is that? Is that I've said that before, is that Ireland is, to me, feels like the most pro-Palestinian country on earth. On earth, that includes all the Arab countries combined,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
But why is that? So Ireland as a country, they got their independence not long ago. Like we're talking, around 1916, that's when they had the big Easter uprising against the British Empire and all that. But behind that, there is a history of 800 years where they suffered unbelievable atrocities, be it, like loss of population. Let me just a small, break here and to say that only last year did Ireland's population regain what it was before the famine. The famine in the
Oh, and
1800s,
numbers.
in numbers,
Oh,
because it
wow.
was kind of like around 5 million, because they lost God knows how many of the population, a lot. A lot of them had passed away, but then a lot of them had to emigrate to feed their families and all that. And it wasn't until last year, or maybe the year before that, that it went back to what it was. So there's this history of having suffered all of this at the hands of the British Empire. On top of it, Ireland is not historically an English speaking country, yet here we are, we all speak English. That's because their native language, Irish or Gaeilge, got decimated by enforcing all of these, the English language and all of that, right? So you'll see that the Irish people, uh, they identify a lot with oppressed people around the world, right? So
And
I don't
it's
know.
not just the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, I got choked up for some reason. So
You're
yeah,
doing much better
they
than me. I think I've lost my voice. I'm now searching for whatever's left in it. No, you're doing just fine.
yeah. So they identify with that. So when I say it's kind of like in here, they identify with the Palestinian cause because they see as these are people who have lost their lands. They are losing their culture bit by bit. Not culture as in in the sense, but in any case. On the other hand, and apologies because I'm going to talk sectarianism just a little bit because I'm going to talk a little bit about Northern Ireland. Is that even though the struggle over there in the north is between Catholic and Protestant, but we all know that it's a little bit more than that. The same way how it was in Lebanon,
Yeah.
between Christian and Muslims.
Yeah.
But over there, you'll see that the Catholics, who would mostly identify as Irish, would be pro-Palestinian, and a lot of the people who would be Protestant, and a lot of them identify as British as opposed to Irish. They would I honestly don't know if they support Israel because they support Israel or just to be opposed to the Catholics.
That's well
It's kind of
said.
like,
Actually, I'm glad you said this. This is going back 20 years ago. It didn't feel like it's an authentic
yeah,
celebration. It really felt, and this not to be so stupid, but I'm sorry. It felt like a rejection of Bono sometimes.
yeah,
You would hear U2 playing,
well,
then the more pro-Palestinian,
yeah,
politically charged bars,
yeah,
and then you'd have an Israeli flag across the street. It felt more rejection,
yeah.
not
Although, just
embrace.
a small note
Yes.
here is that a lot of people in Ireland, not the North, like in Ireland, uh, aren't too big fans of Bono, but that's for different reasons.
Yeah. For other reasons, yeah. That transcends politics. That's well said. But you know what you're describing to me reminds me a bit about this connectivity where you have the Palestinian cause being discussed in the alleys, in the bars, in the cafes of Belfast. And maybe, and I don't want to, I want to be careful when I say this. Maybe it's sometimes false association, meaning latching on because it feels right, but maybe it's not really the same exact story. It may parallel. And I always felt that there was maybe something wrong there, or it could be delivered wrong. In other words, maybe they should better understand what's happening before they go full on in. And this is
Ah,
where I'll say it in a way that I hope makes sense. This is 20 years ago. When I was there were still bombings in Belfast. So things are improving, but it's delicate still. And maybe the IRA and Hamas, it's too quick for people to say common cause. I identify fully, and that group is me. I am that group. Almost felt too emotionally charged sometimes.
that's yeah. I do agree that way is that the details weren't. Uh, I said there weren't a lot of getting into the details, but more on the matter of principles.
Right,
And
exactly. Yeah.
but as you mentioned that, by the way, I got into a little bit of trouble when I moved here, just initially, in that I didn't know a lot about the IRA. I knew about Ireland, but not a lot. But when I learned more about them, and apologies to anyone listening, I'm not trying to trigger anybody or anything, but my first reaction when I heard about them was like, oh my God, they're awesome. And let me explain why I said that. Because I learned that, like, they would set up bombs, but then they would call people to warn them in advance. And in my mind, we never had that in Lebanon. It's kind of like, why did we never had, and apologies, I know I'm talking like this is a very sensitive subject to you. I just realized right now. I'm
No,
sorry
don't
about
worry.
that.
No, no,
Yeah,
Fadi, كل
yeah,
يوم. You should even, I mean, you should hear the other conversations I have.
yeah.
No, no, on the contrary.
Yeah,
On the
so
contrary.
initially in my
Yeah.
mind, I was like, oh my God, they warn people so that people would get out and it's only like material damage. But then you realize it's like, no, you can't say stuff like that because there were casualties and all that. But it's kind of like, it's all relative. When you've seen the worst, you look at someone, it's like, oh my God, they're so good. But then you learn.
So this, which I think it's kind of what you do. It's your craft, and that you find something that's fairly complex, and then you reduce it to its basics. You do this with the Arabic language. You do it with Lebanese dialects. You do it, I think you did it even in photography. I think there's a way of reducing and simplifying and making things easier, and in my opinion, oftentimes better, at least for the audience to understand. I think you're trying, this is my way of understanding you, you're trying to do that the way you understand conflict,
Yes.
right? And that's not something that's, you're not, you grew up here. I mean, you know the Lebanese story as much as anyone who grew up in this generation.
Yes.
And I know a bit about your life growing up, not enough, but I know that you brushed with death being in Lebanon, and you have some intimacy when it comes to how to how to find a better way forward through conflict. I think I sense this is what you're doing now with social media, but I'll let you talk here. I don't want to
No, no,
sort of
you're
speak on
no,
your behalf.
no, you're doing great. You- uh, I mean, yeah, as you describe it, it's kind of like we both grew up in Lebanon. Um, like conflict is baked into you.
Yeah,
It's like it's part of it's part of us.
yeah.
And in the end, uh, I maybe there is a reason why the consequences of having been lived in conflict and all that only started to show when I left Lebanon, not when I was in Lebanon. Because when people talk about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, there's the post that's important. It's post.
Right.
So
Yeah.
when you see, and it's kind of like there is some anger and rage inside you that is kind of like you cannot continue living like this. This is not right. Like you can't do it. So it's kind of like, and at the same time, you start thinking it's kind of like of all the conflict between people from different religions back home, or people within the same religions, different political parties and all that, and you think it's kind of like this is not sustainable. So you kind of build yourself an imaginary world where, let's say this conflict didn't exist, or how would I contribute in a smallest way to removal of this conflict? Again, I'm not saying like this is not being conciliatory where it's kind of like I have no principles, I don't want to be, it's not about that, but it's just trying. It's kind of like, can we find at least a little bit of common ground between people on things, and try to bring them together. So in my mind, this is what I like to do. So when it's kind of like when talking about languages, when talking about anything, it's kind of like, okay, what can be common to us? So when I talk about some aspect in the language, it's kind of like, look, it exists in Arabic, it exists in Hebrew, it exists in English, in
Yes.
French. We all have it. There was a point when we were all humans who were, well, we were killing each other over cows or land, but it wasn't matters of the modern conflicts that we have. So can we go? So anyway, that's what comes to mind.
So I maybe I'll try to see if there's any reflection on what you do generally by finding these root words that they're usually they transcend Semitic languages, even occasionally surprising. The word escapes me now. There was one word I thought you delivered really brilliantly. You're like, this is you'd think this would be Levantine and Phoenician, but it's Egyptian. And you would think this would be Turkish, but it's Arabic. You find it's almost like making us realize we're more connected than we appreciate in our history. And then you see what's happening right now on social media.
Yeah.
Have you sensed any of that engagement? Maybe, I mean, looking back on it, do you think that there's a productive role that you're playing in trying to bring some moderation and trying to bring opposing sides together through topics that are not typically heated. I mean, root words should not bring out the worst instincts in us.
No,
Right.
they shouldn't.
Yeah.
They
So do you
shouldn't.
find, do you find that positive role in your own social media?
Um, if I want to say before before everything started now, I would find a lot of, how to say, it's not about the how people were interacting with me. That's always the minimal part, but it always made me happy when people were interacting with themselves. It's kind of like, oh my God, I learned about this. I learned about this. There are certain, let's say, populations that it makes me happy when I see them talking to each other without fighting,
Yeah.
without going too sensitive. I'm going to give you a small example. It's kind of like whenever I see a Greek person and a Turkish person talking to each other in a, like, in a nice way, let's say, it's like, I hope I had 0.001%,
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
yeah, but that's it. I don't want to claim that I have anything to do with this, but it just makes me happy, and I hope it makes them happy. So,
I think that's the benefits of social media in terms of trying to bring out that.
yeah,
I mean, it brought me to you. I
thank you.
actually engaged your contact for that reason. And I know that right now, I'm going to just assume you're being bombarded with messages that come from all sides. It's impossible, maybe, to chart a path of moderation when you're looking at all those comments that come in. But I think you're still doing it effectively. You mentioned in that video, which I want to go back to, it's almost like moderation is a key and it could provide a path forward. And that's a path forward that I don't see myself. I don't know how this ends well for Lebanon. I only see bad, worse, and worst. I don't see a good ending.
The one way forward that I see that I'm going to say something, and it might anger a lot of people back home, especially, and that that the Oslo Agreement. I think implementing it as it should be applied by giving the Palestinians, the West Bank and Gaza as a sovereign country and all that, I think it might be a solution to a lot of problems in our regions. And I don't want to say like as in it's a unilateral thing, but what I'm saying, if Oslo was applied, it might solve a lot in our problem. But again, this is just my personal opinion. And when I say it angers a lot of folks, is that because, there's a lot of folks who still don't believe in that back home.
Mhm.
But from my side, I just kind of like, if Jordan accepted it, if Egypt accepted it, why shouldn't we accept it too? It's kind of like, who among all of us doesn't want to live in peace? Of course, this creates a lot of issues about, it's kind of like, what about all the Palestinian refugees outside and all that? And I understand. And it's so sorry for, yeah, that's what I can say about this without going
What I
too much.
what I get from your content more recently, it's that you're trying to go back to a source of a conflict. So there's this return to what is driving all of this completely insane, which is there is a severe injustice to one side.
Of course
And
there
I've heard
is.
you,
Of
right.
course there is.
And I've heard you've in a way you mastered it in 5 minutes, which is not easy. You found I mean, I think a lot of editing is needed because that's not easy to do. But you take us back to a moment where the core issue is left unresolved.
Yeah.
And then everything else spills out of control.
Yeah.
Is that really what I mean, is that the final message, if you will, that you have
In
to
my
go?
mind, yes, of course.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. In that it'll all go back to what, not just life, but it's kind of like life is the consequence of the lack of freedom. If there is lack of freedom, this will never change. Why would it change? Like, in what universe are we applying the same standards to people who have freedom versus people who do not have freedom? I'm thinking, it's kind of like, if I'm thinking myself, right? It's kind of like, the times when we were occupied, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there a time where the anger got to a level where you wanted to hurt, you know, and we're just talking about the soldiers back home and all that. And this is minimal to whatever the Palestinians are going through. So in my mind, it's kind of like, yeah, I might like, if that happened to me, I might do worse. Like, of course. So it's kind of like, if there is no freedom, nothing will change. And by freedom, the people keep saying it's kind of like, well, you know, Israel got out of Gaza in 2005, whatever it is. Like, yeah, you think that's freedom? It's kind of like that's how it is when anyway. Let's leave it at that for that, because I might get like a little bit more agitated than this. But
I'll take two things from that, and you can say what you'd like. The first is less personal. The second one, you can pick and choose at your discretion. This type of narration that you're doing, and I think it's almost like a daily job now. Do you find in your circles that they're listening to this? Maybe Dublin's an easier audience.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you find that, I don't want to say echo chamber, but something that you don't feel like you need to push that far.
No. It's this is why it's kind of like the main. I don't want to say opposition, but resistance to what I say might come from people abroad.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And people would assume that this would be like. I'm not going to talk about people in Israel, but I'm outside the region. I'm talking, you know, like people in the U.S., people in the U.K. That's not where it's only located. There is a lot of resistance from surprising other countries. So it's kind of like India, for example, as of recent, which is kind of like, okay.
Yeah.
So this is where it's kind of like, if I'm going to talk, I want to talk in a way without it being automatic rejection, as in listen to me for a minute and then think about it, you know.
And I'll push one step further before getting to the second part. I wanted to fully grasp that video's message. Were you hinting that one side has gotten close to that ideal and robbed the other side of what they deserve?
Hell
because
yeah.
there's a moment in the clip you're talking about. It's almost like absolute power would destroy any society. The Israelis are not special. They've been given that kind of leverage to do what any society would do when there's no constraints. Was that the narrative there?
Yeah.
That Palestinians don't have that option?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It's a very simple, straightforward video. You know, that's
in my mind it is.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it is. It is. The second part to the question, at your discretion. Did you find yourself channeling something like that in Lebanon? Because I know you as somebody who kind of exited the scene. You come in and out, but you left a while ago. I mean, going back nearly 2 decades ago, you first traveled out of the country.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I came back.
You came back, that's true. But you're in Dublin, of all places.
Yes, yeah. But what I mean is that I lived in Lebanon during when the first طلعت ريحتكم thing against the garbage picking up. I was there. I was there for I don't know, a decade almost, right? And it was the first time where I noticed that. By the way, it was that time that was a bit of a wake up moment for me, because I remember there were the people who were mostly online, us the Lebanese who were communicating mostly in English, and then there were the regular folks, and I lost quite a few friends during that period where it felt like as if we were talking just like these echo chambers, right? So it was kind of like, yeah, something has to change. Like this isn't, even if you remember the elections for Beirut Madinati, for example, in my mind, it's like everybody I know online, is going to vote for them because that's what it looks like. And then, it's like nobody voted for, relatively speaking. So yeah, this is where it's kind of like, no, this has to change. This form of communication where you're talking with people who believe the same things as you, thinking this is how the world runs. Well, no, excuse me, but it's not. So this is why we have to communicate and get exposed to people who think unlike us to be able to, narrow down into what we believe in and communicate it to them in a way that they would understand, while removing all the language that is unnecessarily triggering, let's say. Facts are facts. They'll still be the same.
exactly. So that kind of communication craft coming from a conflict zone, and then you're in and out of the country. Now that you're living abroad,
Yeah,
you work abroad, your home is abroad.
yeah.
Uh, are those skills you honed abroad? Are you able now to take that distance and sort of simplify things that you wouldn't be able to here? Because I don't want to overstep here, but I know the story, and you've shared it in other platforms. I mean, you almost died on February 14, 2005. You were within the vicinity of Rafiq Hadidi's assassination, and you came close. And then I can imagine you have two choices there. You either turn to anger and rage, or you channel it in a way that I think is only productive. So is that, I don't know, does that require that kind of distance that you achieved and now you're able to better understand in a way your own job, I think, kind of requires a bit of
Yes,
patience and yeah.
but well, I mean, I said I don't mind shit mentioning here is that uh, the patience that comes from years of teaching little kids math. That's a different thing. It's kind of like when you're teaching, you have to do it. But but distancing yourself and removing that rage, as I mentioned to you earlier in private, is that I had to go through years of therapy for that, which I'm still going for. It's like for PTSD, and it's not just about what happened during the 2005, but having our house was bombed like 3 times, our building was bombed 7 times.
Yeah.
It's kind of like there's a lot of anger there. It's kind of like how do you live your life? Yeah, it's not doable if you don't get rid of this anger. So yeah, there was a lot of hard work done, and even there, I can't say it's like I'm zen. It's like even when I was doing the video, I said I wanted to be as detached as possible, but there were at least 2 times where I had to pause and redo it because anytime I mentioned the forced removal of 1.1 million Gazans, I like right now I'm just like yeah, like you choke up. So it's kind of like it's hard work to remove that much emotion from our speech when it comes to talking. So yeah,
I think I think it's difficult. I mean,
yeah,
your journey is it's a personal one, and you're overcoming something which has impacted you on a personal, individual level. I think it's difficult to do this anywhere on the planet right now. Trying to frame something in a way that's digestible and really giving communication its chance. I'll ask you one more question though about language and its abuse.
yes,
Are you finding a way? You said triggering earlier. You didn't want to use words that
yeah.
trigger. If it's maybe sounds stupid, but are these key words like, I mean, are they subjective words? Are they things that are thrown around stupidly on the news? Like, could you give examples of those choice words?
Well, yeah, this way of, let's say, I don't want to say maybe abuse, but it's kind of like overuse of a
Mm,
certain word where it becomes a triggering has been going on in mostly Anglophone countries,
mm.
It has nothing to do with the war. It's, let's say, even talking about the word colonizer, right? So
Right.
initially,
Yeah.
colonizer meant a certain things. Now you see people very comfortable with calling people, you're colonizing my food, you're colonizing my TV news, something like that. It's become way, it's kind of like more accusatory as opposed to describing something. It's ridiculous, It's so in my mind, it's kind of like this whole making the language academic more than it is normal. It's weird, and it's seeping to our language back home, by the way, because there is a lot of influence from whatever's going on in the U.S. Not just in Lebanon, but even in Ireland. So, for example, I'm going to give you an example.
Yeah.
So, the patriarchy, right? So, the system of patriarchy, it had a name in Arabic, which is the expression "nizam al-abawi." It's explanatory. It says what it is. But apparently that was enough. That wasn't enough. So that a few years ago, now we have to import the word as is and use the word patriarchy to
Yeah.
talk about the patriarchy. A word like, let's say, gender, right? The word gender, we don't have it in Arabic. So it got imported as jandar. So my idea
Right.
is that the way words, like, how do you make people in Lebanon reject a word, bring a foreign word, and force them to use it, as opposed to make something local? So what I mean by triggering languages, words, it's not just about you know the complicated stuff like colonizer and stuff like that, but even word like gender and stuff like that. And this should not be the case.
So that's
Imagine, yeah,
yeah. So that's on the other side, meaning you find in your, let's say, your own communication that there's a disconnect in context almost.
yep,
That these are words that don't carry the same kind of weight given
yes,
where we are. That's interesting. So you're able to find where there's gaps in communication, but for otherwise what sounds like well-intentioned ideas.
yeah,
It's
well,
not that they're
yes.
coming from a bad place. Yeah, yeah,
Uh, by the way, there isn't any. I'm not doing an active exercise in doing this. In my mind,
mm, yeah,
so I went to college and I'm speaking English right now and all that, like I said. But what if I'm communicating with my father who does not speak English? I mean, he
yeah.
understands a little bit, but I want to say the words to him in Arabic. I'm going to use the language he uses. Like what we would call from English a blue collar. He was a fireman, right? It's kind of like there's a specific language where if I use language that's a little bit academic, it's like who the hell do you think you are? That kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
So in my mind, it's like
It's humbling. It's humbling. Yeah,
as it
yeah.
should be, as it should be. It's kind of like I have to use language that is the language of the common people everywhere. I don't want to talk like someone who has a PhD. Like this is, to me, this is embarrassing. Where I understand some of the
Mm,
anti-intellectualism or
mm,
anti-elitism that happens because a lot of these folks are condescending in their language, and I don't like condescension that way.
mm. So it's almost like you're finding assumptions built in that
Yeah.
could be, yeah, that's interesting. But you know that this academic world of it, you're reminding me sort of in a funny way of Bernard Khoury. I spoke
Okay.
to him a few months ago on an MTV,
Yeah.
and he talked about his interaction with language too. It's not the same subject, but he talked about his discomfort when everything is flattened to the point that there's no context whatsoever. And that sounds to me more like ideology than communication.
Yeah.
So is that your battle in a way, trying to combat what are false assumptions, trying to give context to language?
Yes.
Because I think that is the backbone of your at least your social media.
This sort of language that I do not like, it's not because the word themselves also, it's not because of the elitism, but what bothers me a little bit is that because there's a little bit of, how to say, these words and the concepts are traveling from places to other
Yeah,
places
yeah,
where it's almost as if we're required to speak the same way.
exactly. Yeah, right.
And this specificity for each language where it's removed, it bothers me. I'll give one example. It might be a little bit controversial, but for example, in Irish, in the Irish language, uh, when we talk about people, whether what race they are, white, black, something like that, in Irish, there is no concept of black person because the black folks would have been called, a black person would have been called Fear Gurum, a blue man.
Oh,
And that blue is not meant in any shape or form as something bad
mm,
because it was related to one rejecting the term black man, Fear Dov, because that means the devil. And they don't want to call any people the devils. And two is because the way color the way color is represented in each language. The blue meant either the blue shimmer on the black hair or the
oh,
blue shimmer of the,
yeah,
like a lot of things, right?
yeah,
So that's in Irish. That was the term. It's a beautiful term, I think. Next came in how English started to imposing the whole thing. And now they have, I'm not going to say it in Irish, but they translated the term people of color or person of color, which is a completely Anglophone term that has nothing to do
yeah.
with Irish or Ireland or the concept of it into Irish. So this forced homogeneity of language across different cultures is unnecessary and it needs to be fought, in my mind.
I've heard do you even express it when it comes? It's almost like a bridge between language and politics sometimes. That
Absolutely.
purity in language is also counterproductive, and dialects disappear for that reason.
Yes.
It's almost like languages that we assume there's so many languages that went extinct for that reason, and that is politics,
Yes.
less linguistics, lexicon, and
If I may break my own rule, I'm trying not to say it's not like
sure.
use the academic word, but what I do not like is linguistic imperialism and cultural imperialism. In that sense, you know,
Right.
it's kind of like where eventually we would lose this unique nature of each language and the way it expresses itself, just to, you know, take in words that have no place in there. Anyway.
One final question. Flipping what we just said on its head,
Yes.
is there any other way to bring care to the Palestinian cause without making other people feel like it's part of their life too? Because I think we're talking about the opposite now.
Okay.
It's almost like, is there any other than what we do? How
Okay.
would you? Yeah.
It's a bit difficult to answer because, again, these are my own assumptions.
Sure, of
People
course.
might not believe them. What people talk online, what people consider activism or slacktivism, in other words, in my mind, this doesn't do anything. As in someone, me talking, like who am I? Like, how's it going to do any difference? It doesn't. Because in my mind, the only way that can make a difference, which is how I linked my video to a fundraiser for the UN for the food program. Like, this is the only way that would,
Right.
like, is
Yeah.
actual.
That's
The other thing is, forget about all the us people online. You know, there are journalists doing their job, bringing the, you know, from bringing stories from there instead of us people carping us. Like, look at what's happening. It's like, yeah, and that's not going to do anything unless it's linked with something that actually makes sense. Like imagine someone in Gaza, what? Like they're going to watch my video and it's like, oh, thank God, that makes me feel so much better. Like,
yes. Yeah.
like you know, look, I mean, I'm a no one that way. So at least we can link it to something
Yeah.
where I don't know if I'm making any sense
No,
here,
you're making
but
sense, but I meant it actually more like when you're not uh, cultural imperialism. Was that the
yeah,
phrase? Okay. Are we are we doing something wrong when we're trying to completely connect the Palestinian cause to other stories? Let me give you an example. I don't want to be too hard on anyone without, but I don't want to be unfair. But I don't know if you saw this. It was, I think it was on Twitter. Greta Thunberg and the climate change. Yeah.
okay,
Okay. So this, yeah. This is where I was going. And four Palestinian flags,
yeah,
four different slogans. Maybe three of them had actually, there was only one I think that was sort of on point. The other three were latching causes to the Palestinian cause.
yeah.
Yeah, so this is where I was. Yeah, that to me is a bad way of explaining what's happening.
Uh, no, I understand what you mean, and yeah, I think it does a disservice to the Palestinian cause, let's say, in my
Yeah,
mind, because a it's kind of like if you're bringing another, let's say, global warming, it's kind of
right.
like leave that behind. Like what? Like I would want the people who don't think global warming exists to
Yeah,
support, you know, the Palestinians as opposed to being just by seeing Greta Thunberg that being turned off. But yeah, I
right.
understand the whole idea about latching on to different causes and it doing a disservice, which unfortunately that tends to happen a bit in some circles, let's say, where it's like, oh, we have this cause and this cause. It's like, for the love of God, just focus on one thing just to be able to do what you want to do.
Different people, different universes. Greta Thunberg, that photo, and then your 5 minute sort of step by step simplification. I would rather spend 5 minutes listening to
Thank you.
you
Thank you.
offering those facts than
Thank you.
wanting to think that every cause is the
Thank
same.
you.
Yeah. So that's a credit to you, Fadi.
Thank you.
I think honestly, I know I'm overstepping here, but because you're full of positive energy online, even when you're sort of showing us why late scripts began from right to left, with almost like a hammer and chisel, and you're so positive, you're smiling, you're delivering history with a breath of fresh air. I know, I can tell when it's emotionally exhausting, and you found a way to break down, to simplify in a principled way the Palestinian-Israeli mess while giving justice and honor and dignity to the Palestinians. I thought you did it poetically, and it was on point. And was it Kerning Cultures, the Lebanon episode? Anyone that wants to check out what you did, which I think is crazy. You went to all the Lebanons in the US, you found them, and then you went back and planted trees.
Yeah.
Cedar trees. Yeah. So that's quite a mission, and you accomplished it. So thanks, Fadi. I'll put this on the podcast later with some
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Cheers. Good night. Good night.